This video is sponsored by Into the AM. Hello and welcome to Projector, and on this episode, Ian McKellen is the critic with a nasty wit and an even nastier scheme to save his job. In 1934, the most notorious theatre critic in London is Jimmy Erskine, played by Ian McKellen, with Nina Land, played by Gemma Arterton, often on the receiving end of his put-downs. Jimmy writes for the Daily Chronicle, which has been taken over by Mark Strong's David Brooke after his father's death, and when Jimmy is arrested for his homosexuality, Brooke sees the opportunity to fire him with a month's notice. When Jimmy learns that Brooke is a secret admirer of Nina, Jimmy employs her to seduce Brooke in a blackmail scheme to keep his job. The critic is based on the 2015 book Curtain Call, written by Anthony Quinn. No, not that one. I mean the one that was the film critic for The Independent until 2013, at which point he became a full-time novelist. It's actually the first in a series of books featuring the same characters, but the movie is very loosely adapted from the source material. The book is more of a murder mystery centered on the tie-pin killer, so named because the murderer puts a tie-pin through his victims' tongues. This plot has been entirely removed from the film, along with several characters who are related to it, while still broadly keeping it an ensemble piece set in the 30s theatre world, and does keep some of the same characters, but adds several new ones for the film version. Although, weirdly, the film is set 2 years earlier than the book, which was set in 1936. Jimmy was more of a side character. In the book, he was in it, but he ended up being something of a scene stealer, so the film reconfigures the plot so that now he is at the centre of its story. The film is adapted by Patrick Marber, who is a prolific screen and theatre writer who previously adapted Notes on a Scandal, and the film is directed by Anand Tucker, whose last film credit was the terrible Amy Adams rom-com Leap Year, which was 14 years ago, believe it or not. The film premiered at last year's Toronto International Film Festival, where it received fairly middling reviews at the time, but the version that's playing in cinemas now is not the version that played in festivals a year ago. That's because the producers, after that response, decided to rework the movie, and that was aided by money from the newly launched UK distributor True Brit Entertainment. This is their launch title, so they put money into it to add new scenes, reshoot footage, and do a top-to-bottom re-edit. Now, as a critic who's known for being a bit passionate in my own reviews, do all these changes make it a better movie? Sorta. Not really. Summer is over, and in the UK, that means the sunshine as well. But luckily, thanks to the shirt from today's sponsor, Into the AM, I can remind myself that sunny days do occasionally happen, and this is one of their great designs of a wonderful beach scene. In fact, they've got a whole host of great ones to choose from, and if you want to choose a shirt of your own, you can go to my affiliate link, intotheam.com/filmbrain, and get 10% off, as well as help support the channel. In the meantime, I'll keep wearing this shirt until the sun comes out next summer. It's easy to see why they made Jimmy the central character of the film version, especially when he's played by Ian McKellen. Jimmy is a deliciously wicked character who is extremely arrogant and something of a prima donna. He doesn't want to be interrupted in his work, especially when he's writing his notes during the interval. Jimmy doesn't just enjoy the power that his critiques give him, which can make and break shows and careers, but also he wields it brutally and scathingly for anything that he disapproves of. While he can be glowing in his praise, he's far more known for the venom of his negative reviews, earning him the nickname The Beast. That kind of reminds me of someone. He especially enjoys being very deliberate and specific about his word choices, making sure to twist the knife in the way that feels most cruel. It's his way of asserting his sense of superiority, both over his readers, but also the creators of the plays that he sees. At one point, there's actually a scene where an editor pulls him up over an obscure word in one of his reviews, and he defends it by going, "I don't think our readers can read." When the editor forces him to change it, he crudely and begrudgingly alters it to fat-arsed, which makes clear that the intent of much of his reviews is to simply insult people. So far, so anti-ego, but McKellen not only manages to make such a pompous and selfish figure watchable, but he manages to give him some level of depth than just simply being a caricature, which he could have easily been in lesser hands. Jimmy is very loosely based on the real-life critic James Agate. Jimmy looks up to Oscar Wilde in particular, claiming he met him as a young man, and there's meant to be a deliberate parallel to the fact that he, like Wilde, lives large almost to the point of self-destruction. But also, like Wilde and like Agate in real life, Jimmy is homosexual, and you have to remember that this is at a time when homosexuality was criminalised, so being openly gay was extremely dangerous, and his sexuality is something of an open secret, especially amongst those of the paper. Everyone knows, but as long as he keeps it out of the headlines, that's all fine. Jimmy himself seems to think that his privileged position working at the paper protects him somewhat, and I think that encourages his behaviour to a certain extent, because he thinks that he's above it all. He is the paper, as he describes himself. Jimmy lives with his secretary, Tom Turner, who's played by Alfred Enoch, but he's not just the one that's typing up his reviews and offering word choices, he's also Jimmy's partner, and serves as something of his conscience at some points, appealing to his better nature, the beauty, rather than the beast. And McKellen is terrific as always. He's absolutely relishing the part. He is chain-smoking all the way through the film and gleefully delivering the critic's choice insults. There's one moment where he compares the performance to a deflating dirigible, which especially tickled me. If I was going to compare the critic to something, it would be Marber's previous screenplay, Notes on a Scandal, but here there's less of a surprise to McKellen playing this kind of role. He has played villains plenty of times before. You think famously of his Magneto in the X-Men film series, Richard III, the Good Liar a few years ago, even Iago in Trevor Nunn's staging of Othello. I know, I have a BA in film and theatre. Now you compare that to Judi Dench, who is the star of Notes on a Scandal, and Dench is normally known for being quite gentle and righteous as a screen presence, so it's very surprising to see her so venomous and scathing about everyone in her vicinity. That doesn't make Ian McKellen's performance less enjoyable, just less unexpected in the same way. There's not that same weird cathartic charge as seeing Dench play very much against type. The newspaper Jimmy writes for, the Daily Chronicle, is clearly inspired by right-wing family newspapers like the real-life Daily Mail. There's a couple of moments where the Mail is actually described as the in-universe competitor to the Chronicle, and Mark Strong's David Brooke is the new owner and editor. His father previously owned the paper and he dies at the beginning of the movie, and obviously he didn't have a great relationship with his father because he calls him a bastard in the film's opening moments. So Brooke is new management and he wants to make changes at the paper. He wants to restore the reputation of the Chronicle and he wants to change it in his own image, and he doesn't particularly like Jimmy or his attitude because Jimmy is part of the newspaper's old guard. He, like Ron Cook's opera critic for example, spend much of their time boozing it up together when they're not doing their work. They think they're untouchable because they represent the paper, they've been there for the longest time, and they aren't. Jimmy is repeatedly warned that he's on thin ice, especially because Brooke is very protective of the paper's reputation and he could potentially threaten that. So when Jimmy is arrested, Brooke sees that as the right time and excuse to oust him from the paper and do exactly what he wants to do. And Mark Strong is reliable as ever, playing Brooke as very much a man of reputation, not just of the papers, but also his own. And there's something kind of noble about him in a sense, a kind of integrity that Strong underplays quietly. There's rumours that he's involved in a tragic marriage. When the critic and Brooke first encounter each other, he can barely hide his disdain for him, but he knows how to play the politics of the paper and he knows how to communicate. He does have a degree of patience with Jimmy, until he doesn't. Another strong performance in the film is Gemma Arterton as Nina Land, who's an actress that desperately seeks validation. She's been acting for years and she wants to be a star, but she's now at the point where she's starting to age out of being the young starlet, and she has very little to show for it. She's very much going from job to job to job. And Leslie Manville plays her overbearing stage mother. She's trying to help out, but in a very controlling way, even though she wants the best for her daughter. daughter. There's an early scene where she tries to interfere with the Critic, and the Critic is very, very angry at her for doing so. Nina actually looks up to Jimmy as much as she despises him because his reviews were actually the reason she started acting, but now, unfortunately, she is the victim of his cruel barbs, and she has taken so much of them over the years that eventually she just goes out one day and confronts him about it. And when that happens, an unusual relationship starts to form between them. Jimmy actually starts giving her advice and help with her acting, especially because he feels that that sense of needing to be validated actually appears in her performances. She overacts, she does too much, and his main piece of advice is less. And it's in these scenes that we actually start to see a softer side to Jimmy that helps him be more empathetic to the audience, and that is crucial because, again, the central character of the movie can't be a one-note cruel Critic caricature. Nina's vulnerability and anxiety make her very easily exploited. She's deeply fragile, and that's something that Jimmy takes advantage of when he involves Nina in his scheming against Brooke. He understands that Brooke has an interest in Nina, so he concocts this scheme and recruits her in it, understanding that she craves his validation most. He requires that she does this for him in exchange for positive reviews of her plays. He has the ability to turn her into a star, while also threatening that if she doesn't, he will absolutely ruin her. And Arterton is terrific. She is holding her own with McKellen, who she often shares many of the scenes in the film with, and I think she's an underrated performer. She obviously had that patch where she was appearing in a lot of big budget blockbusters, but they didn't make the best use of her, and a few years ago she decided to move away from that and focus on smaller projects, and you can definitely see that with something like The Critic, which benefits her and she benefits the movie. The Critic is being billed as a thriller, and I think that's being maybe a little bit generous in terms of description. I personally found it to be more of a character drama, but it's also a very uneven one, especially in the first half, where it feels a bit unfocused before the blackmail plot actually comes into view around the halfway point of the film. It tries to keep the ensemble feeling of the book, which is very period specific, and there's a lot of detail in the movie, but with somewhat mixed results. For instance, a major subplot in the movie is the rise of fascism that's playing out in the background. The cop that arrests Jimmy is a fascist, for example. We see the badge on his jacket, but also Oswald Mosley is name dropped. There's a scene where Jimmy actually confronts a group of black shirts and taunts them on their uniforms walking down the street. There's a moment where Tom is afraid to walk down there as a black man, and Jimmy actually encourages him to walk down there because we have every right to walk down there. And it's actually a great scene. It's a fantastic moment because McKellen is brilliant in it. There's something quite amusing about him taunting and flirting with danger in that way, and there's a catharsis for the audience at seeing him turn his scathing wit towards a deserving target. But it's a good scene that actually, ironically, shouldn't be in the movie, and the problem is that it doesn't really go anywhere. Like, they put in all this period detail into the movie, but it doesn't actually factor into the main plot or feel especially relevant, so it just ends up detracting. You end up going, why does it focus so much on this stuff? I think this is because of the very slight shift in setting from book to film. The book was set 2 years later, and if you think of major events in 1936, you would think of the abdication of Edward VIII, who of course was notoriously a fascist sympathiser. So having that in the background of the story, and having all of these events tying in with it, makes sense. But if you remove that, suddenly these all lack that context, and it feels purposeless. And while the film has an extremely strong cast which makes it highly watchable, I don't always think they're very well utilised. For example, Leslie Manville gets a few scenes early on in the movie prominently, and then her character almost totally disappears until she pops up at the end of the movie. And I don't think this is necessarily a result of the editing, but more the fact that this is just a small part. Apparently, she was filming this alongside her work on The Crown, but that means that we've cast the actor to give a bit more depth to what is ultimately a bit part, and you think that Manville could have had a bit more to play here. You've also got a subplot with Ben Barnes, who's actually making his first film appearance in a decade. He plays the artist Stephen, and he's working on a portrait of the writers and employees of the Daily Chronicle, and obviously Jimmy wants to be a part of that. There's actually an early scene where we see Jimmy sat down for a session with Stephen, and Jimmy wants to be a part of this extremely badly because he figures it's his way of being immortalised as being part of the Chronicle, and this ties in with those themes of legacy that run all throughout the film, but especially with Jimmy. That's the reason why he compares himself to Wilde, because he sees himself as being inspired, but maybe perhaps equal in terms of his thinking. He wants his writing to be something that's studied after he's gone. But also you see Stephen is having an affair with Nina, who's been convinced by Jimmy to seduce Brooke, who unbeknownst to Jimmy is Stephen's father-in-law. If this sounds really convoluted and like something out of a daytime soap, especially when of course it obviously all blows up, then yeah, it is. That's because Romola Garai plays Stephen's wife, who is Brooke's sister, but it's a largely peripheral and thankless role, unfortunately. And you're probably starting to see the issue here. There's far too many characters and storylines competing for screen time, and I actually think the film might have benefited from being tightened up even further, to push it even more towards straightforward thriller territory, and maybe drop the extraneous elements, especially because, in my opinion, I do think the film loses something when McKellen is off screen, especially because he is such a magnificent screen presence, but just in general, despite the strong cast, it feels like there's not quite a spark when he isn't on screen. I do think the film does get stronger when the blackmail plot goes into motion, but even then, when that happens, there is about a 15-minute stretch when McKellen disappears out of the movie, and it just feels weirdly flat. There's not enough tension actually being built up out of that particular plot line. Instead, there's more of a sense of theatrical tragedy to the way it unfolds, which I suppose makes sense. The film turns much, much darker than anticipated in its final third. The way that Jimmy's scheme starts to affect and taint everyone involved with it in unexpected and surprising ways. There are some devastating plot turns as the scheme starts to spiral out of control. There, the thriller elements start to become more prominent and it starts to become more compelling, especially as Jimmy's true chilling nature in all his callousness starts to really emerge at this point. It goes from simply being simple insults in print to something far more Machiavellian and selfish and sinister and absolutely, totally destructive. The Critic is a decent movie, as it should be with all that talent involved with it, but it's also not a great one. McKellen obviously is the highlight of the movie, as is Arterton, and the scenes they share together are easily the best in the movie. But there's also something about the adaptation and the direction that doesn't quite grip in the way that it really should do, and even though they've tried to address this by adding new scenes and recutting the film, it still feels like there's something missing, something absent. It doesn't quite gel together all the elements, and I think it's simply because the storytelling is a bit too messy and distracted, and it has that at its core fundamentally. You can't change that with simply just recutting. That's a writing and adaptation issue. It is an enjoyable watch, largely on the basis of McKellen, but you won't be coming back for an encore. If you like this review and you want to support my work, you can give me a tip at my Ko-fi page, or YouTube's Super Thanks feature, which is right below the video. Or you can send me my critical praise at my Patreon, where you can see my videos early among other perks, including access to my Discord server, and you can join YouTube memberships for similar perks. Or you can just simply like, share and subscribe, it all helps. Until next time, I'm Matthew Buck, fading out.